Hello everyone, Daniel here. Now I'm in a new place and behind on my vlogs and that sucks, but I feel like I need to say something that hasn't been said loudly enough. And I know that my dinky little channel isn't going to change a damn thing at this point, but I want to make something very clear to everyone who will still listen. And it's about the election, so I apologize for bringing up a sore subject, but we're going to have to confront this thing if we're going to make it better, so here we go. This election is f***ed up. I mean, every election is difficult, but I'll speak for myself. This wasn't my ideal outcome thus far. I'll level with you all. I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primaries. I believe in his message of justice and equality, his hopeful and unifying attitude, and his evidentially supported and carefully reasoned policy arguments. All that aside, the fact remains that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are the candidates that have the most chance of winning this year. For better or worse. Now, neither has escaped a fair share of controversy this election. Their paths are marred by unfortunate and suspicious circumstances. Hillary Clinton is a seasoned politician, seen as corrupt or untrustworthy by many, and has previously supported policies that don't necessarily jive with her current platform. Donald Trump is not a politician at all, and his rep as a billionaire philanthropist is tainted by near bankruptcies, failed business ventures, and deceptively non-existent charitable donations. For more information on their scandals, there's a link in the doobly-doo. Their various policies and principles have undergone public scrutiny over the past few years, and especially over the past few months. I've linked to some of the many print and video articles examining the viability of some of their policies. But what I want to talk about today are the broadest implications of what voting for each of these candidates would actually mean. Now, there is a real danger of stereotyping individuals based on their opinions, reducing people to the most basic and most easily criticized of their beliefs. There is also a danger of creating just another shouting match or echo chamber on the internet, which would be less than productive. Also, by now I've doubtless been stereotyped by many of you by who I voted for in the primary. But I know and accept the risks and consequences of a discussion like this. Nevertheless, I strongly request that the conversation remains civil whenever possible, which is more often than you think, so let's make the effort, all of us. So I want to talk about something that's not talked about nearly often enough. Sacrifice. It's a weird topic, I know, but one worth considering. There are many types of sacrifice. Most often in contemporary politics, it's seen as a very good thing, particularly in the context of our military. Brave men, women, intersex, and transgender individuals willing to sacrifice their lives, their bodies, their minds, and apparently their livelihoods when they get home, so we get to keep ours. Now, these are each personal sacrifices, which are very important for self-development and for the spirit of the country. But the collective sacrifice, that's where stuff really happens. Continuing with the military example, one person fighting for what they believe is right is, in many ways, singular. A martyr if the cause is seen as noble, a lone wolf if the cause is seen as harmful. But a group of people willing to fight for what's right is significant. An army can change the world, for better or worse, as can an organization or a philosophical movement. For example, police are willing to sacrifice their lives in order to keep our neighborhoods safe and enforce the law. And we should be grateful for their will and their service, which is largely beneficial. Black Lives Matter and other movements also sacrifice much. They risk incarceration, mischaracterization, prejudice, and further violence, all in order to draw attention to the horrifying consequences of systemic, subtle yet still existent racial discrimination in policing. Our presidential candidates also sacrifice. Donald Trump is sacrificing personal and corporate financial resources in order to present himself as a candidate. And Hillary Clinton is sacrificing her spotty reputation and physical health in order to attempt a campaign of engagement and transparency. Of course, sacrifices can be riskier and less beneficial, especially if one has the power to sacrifice the resources of others. Donald Trump collectively sacrificed the welfare of his contractors and employees in order to turn a larger profit by not paying them their worth. And Hillary Clinton was willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands of soldiers based on the same shoddy information that was somehow enough to convince our country to go to war in Iraq. These are all significant sacrifices with significant consequences. However, just as important are the ways in which we sacrifice. For example, when the police go out into the streets to prevent and respond to crime, the current philosophy is that they need to be battle-ready, just as committed as the military, willing to do whatever is necessary to kill or be killed to maintain order. This is not how it always was. There have been many other methods of policing and crime control in the past, but this is the current philosophy, starting in the 70s and escalating in the 80s and 90s with the war on drugs. Now, many police are ingrained with inaccurate, race-infused concepts of offenders, and in the current social climate combined with their training, they are occasionally hyper-vigilant, with deadly consequences. So they're still sacrificing, but in a way that may unnecessarily risk innocent lives in the process of protecting them. Similarly, there are proponents of the Black Lives Matter movement, not the organization, but the general movement, who stir up anti-police sentiment, infusing the movement with anger and impatience. They occasionally goad police into shooting prematurely in order to prove discriminatory practice, and some preemptively resort to violence in protests, escalating them into riots. Now, this can be seen as a legitimate, if less justifiable, response to a culturally ingrained fear of armed and trigger-happy police officers. Just as racist violence by police can be seen as a legitimate, if less justifiable, response to a culturally ingrained fear of armed and trigger-happy criminals who fit a racial profile. Nevertheless, these angry individuals sacrifice more than just their own safety when they become violent. They risk the validity of their very movement, and the lives of other officers who can effectively serve the community at large. So both of these groups have flaws in their philosophies. They demand sacrifice from their members that, if taken to the extremes, implicates others in the irreversible violent consequences of their actions. Now that that complex and poignant example is out of the way, let's bring it back to the presidential candidates. candidates? How do the ways in which they sacrifice affect the potential consequences of their presidencies? Before we do this, I have studied the campaign websites, I have heard speech fragments all over the place, and I have watched all the presidential debates thus far, but only one primary debate. Can only take so much, people. That said, Hillary Clinton has settled on a policy direction at this point, and she's pretty consistent. It's an odd situation. Historically, she seems very different from her current platform, which was heavily influenced by the fact that Bernie Sanders chose 5 of the 15 policy writers for the Democratic platform this year. But a closer look reveals not so much a centrist Democrat as a moderate progressive with some hawkish tendencies. Some of those terms seem contradictory, but apparently they're not mutually exclusive. In appealing to displaced centrists and Republicans, Hillary's foreign policy remains somewhat hawkish. Also, though she occasionally talks tough on financial reform, she is backed by many corporations, and her tax plan is quite moderate. Now, in terms of what social issues to implement or spend money on, she's no Bernie Sanders, but there is no question that she is definitely a progressive in this area. She is sensitive to the growing racial tension in this country, she supports women's issues and LGBT issues of all kinds. She also plans to make higher education and healthcare more accessible and more affordable. So the crux of her campaign seems clear. Her sacrifice was, and has always been, her ideological purity and her identity as a purely progressive Democrat. And in previous years, that wasn't even a problem for her. The contemporary Democratic Party has had no trouble being conservative from time to time. Just look at Bill Clinton's policies on everything, from the economy to crime to gay rights. But as the Democrats have gotten younger and more progressive, Hillary faces an image problem. On one hand, she can work with people across the aisle, and she has for decades, but she can still support very progressive social issues. On the other hand, she is an older and more acculturated politician, backed by large financial institutions, the likes of which were responsible for the 2008 financial crisis, making enemies out of progressives by escaping all blame and avoiding prosecution. This has the effect of making Hillary a target for cynical non-support amongst progressives. So she put her chips on the system continuing to work as is. She has sacrificed her credibility as a hardline progressive or an uncorrupted purist like Bernie was. And honestly, she has changed her positions on issues like same-sex marriage in the past, so she never really had that image to begin with. By the way, I'm not even addressing the animosity and bias against her that's amplified by the fact that she is a woman, but the double standards do exist. In terms of the way in which she sacrificed, she could have done a more transparent job of it. She tends to deny rather than explaining or apologizing. This might be why, in addition to the longtime smear campaign, people still believe that she was directly responsible for American deaths in Benghazi and for playing fast and loose with state secrets on her private email server. Regardless of the fact that she was cleared of all charges in both cases and that her digital snafu was not the biggest or worst to ever be perpetrated by a government official or administration. As for Trump, he has infamously said that he has personally sacrificed much for this country. Truth is that he is a child of privilege and has avoided many of the hardships that his followers, the white, middle, and working class, have experienced. And I would like to tell you where he truly stands on issues like abortion and taxes and national security. But, and I say this as neutrally as I possibly can, Donald Trump has been consistent about very few things throughout his campaign. He's both opposed and supported women's rights to abortions in the past. His tax plan seems like it would be detrimental to the 99% and the national economy, but the details have been notably vague until recently. He denied having harped on the Obama birther movement since 2011 and claimed, with all factual evidence to the contrary, that Hillary Clinton started the birther movement and that he resolved it. He treats vague goals and powerful if generic rhetoric as equivalent to actual policy plans on things like the economy and fighting ISIL. Even something as emblematic as his almighty wall has been assigned varying costs, all of which, according to experts, are drastic underestimations. And then he goes to Mexico and puts on his diplomatic face in a very somber tone as if he hasn't been insulting the people and their culture for nigh on a year and demanding that they pay for a wall that is neither a practical nor useful solution to the problem. He was like a bloody SNL sketch of himself. The things he has been consistent on are very worrisome, like his apparent disdain for racial minorities and women and his misinformed essentialist views on sex, gender, and sexuality. Oh right, and he's in favor of global nuclear rearmament. So the answer is clear here as well. Donald Trump, too, has sacrificed his ideological purity and allegiance to any partisan interest, presumably to avoid the obligations of that partisan interest. It is working. Despite running as a Republican, the party of conservatism and strict principles, the party has not been able to reel Trump into either what they want him to say or how they want him to say it. But in reality, he has risked something further than a philosophy or an ideology. Two specific things. First, he sacrificed what were formerly nonpartisan values. Principles that the two parties agreed upon. Things like snappy comments about other candidates' families or personal lives are neither relevant nor amenable to the public political discourse and should be avoided at all costs. Consistency on the issues is paramount to securing the public confidence, as is caring one way or the other about the issues. That is, having an informed opinion. And a very important principle also doubles as the third major thing that Donald Trump has sacrificed during his campaign. It used to be that facts relevant to an issue would be consulted before forming a party line or policy about that issue. Or at least interpreted in favor of the existing party line on that issue. That addendum should be a hint that this policy has eroded over time. There are several explanations for this, many involving the combined effects of a sensationalist advertiser-driven news media more focused on political conflict than factual context, and an increasing ideological polarization in this country between the collective right and left, perhaps augmenting the need for a bias toward fairness in the media. Of course, whatever the reason is for this erosion, I will now state what should be clear to anyone who was not a Trump supporter to begin with. Donald J. Trump led that principle up to the top of a pyramid, prayed to the gods of power and popularity for a bountiful media harvest, and slit the throat of factual integrity with a flint knife. It remains to be seen whether the blood lost from this once highly esteemed idea will be permanent, or whether our policy institutions will be able to survive without at least its nominal presence. Which leads me to my second portion, wherein we turn the lens upon ourselves.